The sun had barely set when the sound of screeching tires pierced through the calm suburban streets. The warm glow of evening wrapped around the houses like a blanket, but for one family, the night was about to take a terrifying turn. A routine drive home was about to spiral into an encounter that would test the limits of patience, dignity, and courage. Little did they know, the figure in the rearview mirror wasn't just any officer, he was the catalyst for a shocking series of events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about justice. As the car slowed to a stop on the side of the road, the family exchanged confused glances. The officer's headlights cut through the dark, illuminating their faces as they prepared for what seemed like a simple traffic stop. But nothing about this encounter would be simple. From the moment the officer approached their vehicle, tension thickened the air. His footsteps were heavy, deliberate, as if he already knew this moment was going to be anything but ordinary. The first words out of his mouth were sharp, demanding, not even a hint of courtesy to soften the blow. It was clear, this wasn't just about a broken tail light or a minor infraction. The family tried to remain calm, but the officer's tone, his body language, everything about him screamed hostility. Why had they been stopped? Was it just the way they looked, the color of their skin, that had led to this? In that moment, it wasn't just about a police officer and a family, it was about the underlying tension that had been brewing for years, a reflection of the larger struggles that many people had faced but often went unnoticed. With every question, the officer's suspicion grew more intense. The tension in the car thickened, hearts began to race. The father tried to explain, but his words were cut short, drowned out by the officer's increasing demands. It didn't make sense. Why was he being treated like a criminal? He wasn't doing anything wrong. The mother's hands gripped the armrest, her voice barely above a whisper, trying to keep the peace, to de-escalate the situation before things got out of hand. But it was too late. The officer wasn't listening to reason, he was intent on something else. Without warning, the officer snapped, barking orders that left no room for negotiation. The family was being detained just like that. The sense of disbelief was palpable. How had this situation escalated so quickly? One moment, they were minding their own business, and the next, they were facing an authority figure who seemed more interested in asserting power than in finding out what had actually happened. They were now caught in a nightmare, trapped in a cycle they had no control over. The father's voice was steady but rising with frustration. He knew the drill: stay calm, stay collected. But it was hard when every action felt like it was being scrutinized, when everything they said or did was twisted into something more sinister. The officer's hand hovered over his belt, fingers tapping nervously. A subtle but chilling sign that things were far from under control. The mother's eyes darted around, her mind racing. Was this the beginning of something worse? Should she speak up or stay silent? Every choice felt like it could make the difference between safety and danger. But just when they thought they couldn't take any more, the officer turned his attention to their children, who were seated quietly in the back. The air grew colder. The family had always protected them from the harsh realities of the world, but now, there was no shelter from the storm. The children could see it too, the fear in their parents' eyes, the tension in their voices. It was a moment none of them would ever forget. As the officer's hand moved towards his radio, signaling for backup, everything in the family's world seemed to shift. They had been calm, they had been respectful, but none of it mattered. In that instant, they realized they were not just fighting for their freedom, they were fighting for their dignity, their safety, and their lives. But just as things were about to take a turn for the worse, something unexpected happened. The father took a deep breath, and in that moment, his decision would determine everything. Would he let fear control him, or would he stand firm and fight for what was right, no matter the consequences? What would happen next would leave you speechless, and it would set the stage for a story that would shake everyone who heard it. The officer's hand hovered over his radio as the family held their breath, unsure of what the next few seconds would bring. Would they be arrested? Would this encounter spiral out of control? This is just the beginning of what would become a fight for justice, dignity, and the right to live without fear. The questions lingered in the air, unanswered. And with that, the tension hung in the balance, leading into a turning point that no one could have predicted. Stay tuned, because the next part of the story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. The officer's fingers lingered over the radio, his gaze never leaving the family's car, as if he was waiting for some sign, some hint that things would go his way. The father's heart pounded in his chest as his mind raced, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. They hadn't done anything wrong. They had been careful, they had obeyed the rules, but somehow, that didn't seem to matter anymore. His thoughts kept circling back to the same thing. Was it because of the way they looked? The car they drove? Or was it something deeper, something the officer wasn't saying but made clear in every word he spoke, in every command he gave? The mother, sitting beside her husband, could feel her pulse quickening. She hadn't been as vocal as he had, but she could sense the rising tension just as clearly. She looked over at the kids in the back seat, trying her best to hide the growing fear in her eyes. They didn't understand what was happening, not fully. They were too young to grasp the reality of the world around them, too innocent to know the power dynamics at play. To them, this was just another stop, another encounter with an authority figure that would end with them on their way. But for the parents, it was something far more serious. This wasn't just a traffic stop. This was a test of everything they had worked for, everything they had believed in. The officer's gaze shifted briefly to the back seat, where the kids sat, looking out the windows, still unaware of the gravity of the situation. The father's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he met the officer's eyes. There was no way to explain this to his children. There was no easy way to shield them from the ugly truths that had always lingered, just below the surface. In the silence, the father's thoughts raced. Had his family somehow become a target because of their race? Could that really be the reason they were being treated like this, pulled over for something as minor as a broken tail light? It didn't make sense. The officer's radio crackled again, a harsh, static-filled noise that seemed to snap the father out of his spiraling thoughts. He didn't know if backup was on the way, if this would escalate into something worse. All he could do was watch, feel the weight of every second pass as the officer lingered by the window, his presence a looming threat. He wasn't sure how much longer they could keep their cool, how much more they could endure without something snapping. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the officer turned away, walking back to his car without a word. The father's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the officer entering his cruiser, typing something into the computer. The sense of confusion and dread only deepened. What was going on? Why had he walked away? Was it a tactic to unsettle them? Or was there something more to it, something he couldn't yet understand? The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. The father couldn't bring himself to turn the car off, couldn't move a muscle as he waited for the officer to make his next move. His wife reached over, placing a reassuring hand on his, though both of them knew that the calm exterior they were putting on was nothing more than a mask. Inside, they were both struggling, trying to hold it together for the sake of their children, but each passing second felt like it was pulling them further apart. "What do you think's going on?" she asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't need to say more. The question was loaded, heavy with the shared fear that had begun to creep into both of them. They both knew that this wasn't just about a broken tail light. They both knew that the officer had made up his mind the moment he laid eyes on them. "I don't know," the father replied, his voice steady but betraying a hint of uncertainty. "But we've got to stay calm. We don't know what he's thinking, but we can't give him a reason to escalate this." The mother nodded, though the words felt hollow. What could they do? What could anyone do when the system felt so rigged against them? Every encounter with authority was a reminder of how vulnerable they were, how easily things could spiral out of control. And now, with their children in the back, the stakes were higher than ever. Outside, the night felt colder. The world around them seemed to fall away, leaving only the tension that hummed in the air. The officer hadn't moved. Neither had they. The family sat, frozen, each one holding their breath, waiting for the next move in this dangerous game. The radio crackled again. This time, the officer didn't walk back to the car. Instead, he stood by his cruiser, speaking into the microphone with a low, gravelly voice. The family could hear the faint murmur of his words through the glass. Something was happening. Something that could make everything worse. The father's pulse quickened. Was he calling for backup? Was this about to turn into something bigger? The officer's hand rested on his belt, and he began to pace slowly beside his car, as if weighing his options. The family's world felt like it had narrowed to that one moment, that one breathless space between them and the officer. They could feel the danger thickening, the walls closing in around them. The father knew he had to stay calm. He had to. But the anger was rising within him, a familiar, burning frustration that had built up over years of similar encounters, of seeing others go through the same thing, of knowing that there were no guarantees, no protections for people like them. Every inch of him wanted to shout, to demand answers, to fight back. But he knew better. He knew that a wrong move could turn everything into a nightmare. It wasn't fair, it wasn't right, but it was the reality they lived in. He could feel his wife's hand tightening around his, and he squeezed it back, silently promising her that they would make it through this. The officer, seemingly content with whatever conversation he was having over the radio, turned his back to the family. He walked toward the front of his cruiser, fiddling with something in his hands, completely ignoring the family he had just stopped. For a moment, it felt like they had been forgotten, like they were no longer a threat, no longer a part of whatever plan the officer had in mind. But that sense of relief was short-lived. Suddenly, the officer's voice rang out, loud and sharp, cutting through the silence. "Step out of the vehicle, now!" he commanded, his tone more forceful than before. The father's heart skipped a beat, the weight of those words sinking in like a stone in his stomach. The mother's breath caught in her throat. She looked at her husband, his face a mask of disbelief. He hadn't expected this. None of them had. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, the reality of the situation sinking in. They hadn't done anything wrong. This wasn't just about a simple traffic stop. This was about something far deeper, something that had been simmering under the surface for far too long. The father opened his door, his hands shaking as he stepped out of the car. The officer's gaze was cold, unfazed, and the family could sense the shift in the air. It wasn't about a broken tail light anymore. It wasn't even about a simple stop. The officer wasn't just an enforcer of the law, he was a figure of power, and power had a way of making people do things they might never have done otherwise. The father stood there, facing the officer, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. The children, now fully awake to the reality of the situation, were quiet, staring wide-eyed from the back seat. The mother's heart raced, her thoughts a blur. She wanted to do something, to speak, to protect them, but she knew that every word, every movement, would be scrutinized, every action would be a potential spark in a powder keg that was already dangerously close to exploding. And then, without warning, the officer's hand moved to his belt. The family held their breath. Would this be the moment everything changed? Or was it already too late? The officer's hand lingered near his belt, and the air grew thick with tension. The father's mind raced, trying to read the situation, but the uncertainty of what was happening left him frozen in place. His wife's grip on his hand tightened, as though she too could feel the weight of every second passing. In the back seat, their children sat wide-eyed, confused, and scared, unable to fully understand what was going on but sensing that something wasn't right. The officer's gaze never wavered. He stood there, still as a statue, waiting for something, a move, a response, an excuse to take action. The father's heart pounded in his chest. He knew that any wrong move could send everything spiraling out of control. His mind flashed back to moments he had seen on the news, the stories of people who had found themselves in situations just like this one. Would this be one of those moments? Would they become another statistic, another story that ends tragically, another headline in a world that seemed to be so quick to forget? "I'm just asking you to step out of the car," the officer said, his voice suddenly cutting through the air, sharp and deliberate. His words hung heavy between them, each syllable like a weight pressing down on the family. The father's mind was clouded with thoughts of the children in the back seat. He couldn't let anything happen to them. He couldn't let this moment become something they would have to live with for the rest of their lives. The officer's posture was rigid, his hand never straying far from his belt. The father's eyes flickered to the mother, who seemed equally tense but was trying to keep her calm. She could see the fear in his eyes, and in that moment she shared it. They had been through so much in their lives, but the unknown, the unpredictable nature of this encounter was something neither of them had ever prepared for. The officer's eyes flicked over to the children again, his gaze lingering for just a moment too long. The family felt a chill at that look, as if it was one that made them feel more like suspects than citizens. The father opened his mouth to speak, to try and reason with the officer, to ask why they were being singled out, but nothing came out. His throat was dry, the words stuck behind the fear and frustration that had built up over the years. This wasn't just a simple traffic stop anymore. It was a reminder of everything they had ever feared, everything they had tried to protect their children from. "I need you to step out of the car now," the officer repeated, his voice cold and commanding. He wasn't asking anymore. He was demanding. The father swallowed hard, his chest tightening. This wasn't just about a broken tail light anymore. This was about control, about power. And it was clear who held the upper hand. The mother took a deep breath and turned to their children, trying to calm them, trying to make them feel safe. But there was nothing she could say that would erase the fear on their faces. The family had been through hard times before, but this was different. This was real. This wasn't something they could brush off. This was an encounter that could change everything, and they had no way of knowing how it would end. The father, still standing outside the car, felt a rush of panic. He wasn't sure what to do, where to turn, or what words to say. All he knew was that if he didn't get this right, everything could go horribly wrong. The officer's eyes were like ice, unwavering, and his stance was rigid. The family felt the weight of every second stretching out, each one feeling longer than the last. "Please, just tell me what this is about," the father said, his voice barely above a whisper, but laced with a frustration that was barely contained. "We're just trying to get home. We've done nothing wrong." The officer didn't answer at first. He just stood there, staring at the father, as if measuring him, as if trying to see if he could break. There was a coldness to his demeanor that was chilling. It was as though the officer didn't just view them as a family, he viewed them as a problem. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, the family hanging on the edge of their seats, waiting for some kind of resolution. But none came. The officer didn't speak. He didn't move. It was as though they were caught in a moment of suspended time, and every second they spent in that car, with the officer standing just outside, made it feel like the ground beneath them was shifting, like they were losing their footing. And then, out of nowhere, a second cruiser appeared. The lights flashed bright against the darkened street, cutting through the night like a beacon. The father's stomach dropped. It wasn't enough that they were already in a tense situation, but now there was more. More officers. More eyes. More potential danger. The new officer got out of the cruiser, walking toward the scene with the same rigid gait, the same sense of purpose. He exchanged a brief glance with the first officer, who nodded silently in acknowledgement. The family could sense a shift, something that wasn't quite right. Were they being treated like criminals? Why was this escalating so quickly? What was the officer hoping to find? In the back seat, the children were silent now, their wide eyes taking in everything. The younger one fidgeted with the seatbelt, clearly nervous, clearly aware that something was wrong. The mother glanced back at them, trying to smile, trying to reassure them, but she knew that they could see the tension in her face, the uncertainty in her eyes. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up the facade. The officer who had initially approached the family now looked at the new arrival. There was something in his eyes, something the family couldn't quite read, but it made their blood run cold. The two officers exchanged words too quiet for the family to hear, but their body language spoke volumes. They were preparing for something. What, exactly, the family couldn't tell, but they could feel it, the shift in the air, the weight of it bearing down on them. The father's mind raced, spinning with possibilities. What had they done wrong? Was it something as small as the way they were dressed? Or was it the way they looked? The officer's tone, the way his eyes flicked over them, it all felt so familiar, so unfair. This wasn't just about a broken tail light anymore. This was about something deeper, something rooted in prejudice, in assumptions, in things they couldn't control. The seconds stretched on, and still, the officer said nothing. The father's pulse was a loud beat in his ears, drowning out the sound of the crickets in the distance, the rustling of leaves in the wind. All he could focus on was the silence, the tension, the sense that things were getting worse, not better. And then, the second officer's hand moved to his holster. The family's breath caught in their throats, their hearts skipping a beat. Was this it? Was this the moment everything would spiral out of control? Would they be dragged from the car, thrown to the ground, treated like criminals when they had done nothing wrong? Stay calm, the father whispered to his wife, though his voice betrayed the fear he was trying to hide. But how could they stay calm when the world around them was closing in, when every action, every word, felt like it could tip the balance, like it could make them the next headline, the next tragedy that no one would remember? The fear wasn't just for themselves, it was for their children, for everything they had built, everything they had fought for. The officer's hand hovered over his holster, and the family held their breath. Would this be the moment that changed everything? Or would they be able to find a way out, to escape the nightmare that was unfolding before them? The silence was suffocating, and the family could feel the weight of every second, every breath, as though the world was holding its collective breath along with them. And then, just as quickly as the tension had built, the second officer's hand dropped away. He turned and spoke to the first officer in a low voice, their conversation muffled but heated. What was happening? The family had no idea, but whatever it was, they could feel that something was changing, but they didn't know how it would play out. Not yet. The seconds dragged on as the officers continued their hushed conversation, their heads bent together, their eyes flicking over the family now and then, as if trying to gauge something: fear, resistance, compliance. Whatever it was, it felt like a test. The father felt it in his bones. The air around them had thickened, each breath harder to take, each moment stretching longer, more unbearable than the last. His mind raced as he watched the officers, each of them now positioned on either side of the family's car, their movements slow, deliberate. Everything about their presence screamed authority, control, and a sense of impending danger. His thoughts shifted quickly between different scenarios. What if they were being set up? What if this wasn't just about the broken tail light, but something more sinister? Something that could escalate so quickly, they wouldn't have time to react, to defend themselves. He swallowed hard, trying to ignore the panic rising in his chest, trying to remind himself that he had to stay calm for his family. But the uncertainty was unbearable. In the back seat, the children were now fully awake, their small faces pressed against the windows, watching the officers with wide, fearful eyes. The younger one had started to fidget, restless, picking at the seatbelt and muttering under their breath. The older child, sensing something was wrong, kept looking from one parent to the other, as though waiting for reassurance, for answers that neither of them had. The mother tried to maintain composure, giving a weak smile in an attempt to calm them, but the fear in her own eyes was impossible to hide. She kept glancing at her husband, who was tense, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to process the situation, as if trying to calculate the best course of action. The officer who had first approached the car had begun pacing back and forth, his steps slow and measured, the silence between them thick with expectation. The father watched him carefully, trying to read his movements, trying to figure out what his next step would be. But there was no telling. The officer seemed to be sizing them up, as if he was deciding whether or not to take things further. "I don't understand what's going on here," the father said quietly, his voice cracking despite his best efforts to stay composed. "What is this about? Why are we still being treated like this?" But the officer didn't respond. Instead, his eyes remained locked on the father, almost like he was daring him to push further. And for a brief moment, the father considered it, asking again, demanding to know why they were being treated this way, why they had been pulled over in the first place. But something in the officer's cold stare stopped him. It wasn't just indifference, it was power. And it was clear that power was all that mattered now. The second officer, who had been standing off to the side, now began moving toward the first officer, their quiet exchange barely audible over the hum of the night air. The father's stomach tightened as he watched them, wondering if they were discussing their next move, the next escalation, or maybe even a way to provoke the family into making a mistake. Every inch of him wanted to stand up, to challenge them. To ask why they were being treated like criminals when they had done nothing wrong, but deep down, he knew the danger of pushing too far. They were already walking a razor-thin line, and one wrong move could shatter everything. The mother caught her husband's eye, her expression a mix of worry and determination. She had always been the more level-headed one, the one who could keep a clear mind in the most chaotic situations. But even she couldn't ignore the oppressive weight of the moment, the tension that seemed to tighten around their family. "We just have to stay calm," she whispered, though the words seemed hollow, like a mantra they had told themselves in the past, but never quite believed. "For the kids. For them." The father nodded, though his heart was anything but calm. He could feel the anxiety building, rising like a wave, and no matter how hard he tried to steady his breath, it only seemed to get worse. The officers hadn't made a move yet, but every second stretched the fear tighter and tighter. They were cornered. Trapped. And then, just when it seemed like they couldn't take the pressure anymore, the first officer's voice sliced through the tension. "I need you to step over here," he said, his words cutting through the silence, harsh and commanding. The father's breath caught in his throat. This was it. They were being singled out. This was the moment when everything would change. The officer's voice left no room for negotiation. There was no choice now. The family was at his mercy. The father hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest, but he knew that there was no avoiding it. He couldn't risk making a scene, couldn't risk upsetting the fragile balance that still hung between them. He glanced at his wife, who gave him a tight, reassuring nod, though her face betrayed the same fear that gripped him. He opened the car door slowly, stepping out into the cold night air, and for a moment, he was struck by the realization that the world around him had gone eerily silent. The street lights flickered in the distance, and the rustling leaves were the only sound left, punctuated by the faint hum of the officers' radios. The officer gestured toward a patch of grass near the side of the road. It wasn't far, but it might as well have been miles. The father's feet felt heavy as he walked slowly, his every movement under close scrutiny. The second officer, who had remained quiet up until this point, stood a few paces behind, his arms crossed, watching the father intently. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. What was about to happen? What were they hoping to achieve with this encounter? Once the father reached the spot, the officer spoke again, his voice low but firm. "Stay right there," he ordered. And for the first time in this entire ordeal, the father felt a surge of rage rise within him. It was like a switch had flipped. He had always known that he had to hold his composure, to show restraint, to be the bigger person, but now he couldn't help but feel the injustice. The power dynamic, so heavily tilted against them, was suffocating. He wanted to yell, to scream at the unfairness of it all, but instead, he clenched his fists, trying to suppress the fury that threatened to boil over. Behind him, he could hear the faint sound of his children's voices, asking what was happening, what was going on, and his heart broke. They shouldn't have to witness this. They shouldn't have to see their father treated this way, shouldn't have to experience this level of fear at such a young age. They were supposed to be safe, supposed to be able to grow up in a world where their worth wasn't determined by the color of their skin. The officer's eyes flickered over to the family in the car, and the father could see the look in his eyes, the unmistakable sense of authority, of control. The officer was waiting for something. Waiting for the father to make a mistake. Waiting for a reason to escalate this further. And in that moment, the father realized just how fragile the situation was. Everything hinged on how he responded. He couldn't afford to slip. He couldn't afford to lose his composure. Not for himself, not for his wife, and especially not for his kids. But as the silence stretched on, the tension mounting with every passing second, it became clear that they were teetering on the edge of something much bigger than a simple traffic stop. What the officers wanted, what they expected from the father, remained a mystery, but the feeling that this situation was about to escalate was undeniable. The father's heart raced in his chest. The world seemed to pause, holding its breath, waiting for the next move. And then, just when it felt like they were at the breaking point, the second officer spoke. "Is he going to cooperate?" he asked, his voice filled with anticipation. The words hung in the air, and the father could feel the entire situation shift. His body tensed, his mind racing. Not knowing what would come next, not knowing if this would be the moment everything went wrong. The father's stomach churned as the second officer's words hung in the air, the question echoing in his mind like a loud ringing bell. Is he going to cooperate? It felt like an ultimatum, an assessment of whether he would comply or whether they would make this situation worse. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, his mind racing. The question lingered like a weight pressing on his chest. What did they mean by that? Was this some kind of test? Or worse, a trap? Just as he opened his mouth to respond, the unmistakable sound of tires screeching on asphalt broke through the tension. A third vehicle appeared on the horizon, the headlights cutting through the dark night, blinding for a moment before it slowed and pulled up beside the scene. The father's heart skipped a beat. Another cruiser? What was going on? Why were there so many officers surrounding them now? As the third car came to a stop, a man in plain clothes stepped out. He wasn't wearing a uniform like the others, but the way he moved, the confidence in his stride, told the father everything he needed to know. This wasn't just another officer, this was someone with authority, someone higher up the chain. The officer who had first stopped the family stiffened, his posture shifting from confrontational to almost deferential as he turned to acknowledge the newcomer. The father's mind was spinning. What did this mean? Was this new arrival going to make everything worse? The plainclothes officer looked over at the family, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the scene. He didn't speak immediately, taking his time to study the family, then the officers. The silence stretched again, thick and suffocating. The second officer glanced over, almost nervously, and the plainclothes man gave a slight nod. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the calm before a storm. Then, without warning, the plainclothes officer turned back to the father. His eyes were cold, calculating. "I've been watching you," he said, his voice low and deliberate. The words sent a chill down the father's spine. Watching him? What did that mean? Was this something planned from the beginning, Or was it just a random coincidence that had led them here? The father's breath caught in his throat. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He felt like he was being trapped in a web, and the more he struggled, the tighter it seemed to get. He was caught between fear and confusion. "What do you mean, watching me?" he asked, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to stay composed. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced back at the first two officers, who were still standing off to the side, watching the situation unfold. They, too, seemed to be waiting for something, some kind of cue, some kind of signal. The plainclothes officer let out a slow breath, his gaze never leaving the father. The tension in the air seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. Then, without warning, he pulled out a small piece of paper from his jacket pocket and unfolded it in front of the family. The father's eyes flickered over it, trying to make sense of the words, but they were too blurry from the shock that was coursing through him. The officer didn't speak again until he was sure the father had seen what was on the paper. The look on his face told the father everything. Whatever this was, it wasn't good. This was something bigger than just a routine traffic stop. "I've got a file on you," the plainclothes officer said, his tone eerily calm. "You've been flagged. This isn't a random stop. You're being watched." The father's heart pounded in his chest. Flagged? Watched? What on earth was happening? This was no longer just a traffic stop. This was something entirely different, and the father had no idea how to navigate this new reality. The mother's grip on her husband's hand tightened. She had heard it too, every word the officer had said, and the realization began to settle in her chest like a lead weight. They were no longer just innocent people pulled over on a quiet street. They were now the center of attention for something much darker, something they hadn't anticipated. The world they had known had just shifted beneath them, and they were left struggling to find solid ground. The second officer, who had been standing off to the side, now seemed to take a step closer, as if he were waiting for something more to happen. The father's mind raced, trying to make sense of the officer's cryptic words. What file? What had they done to get flagged? They were just a family, trying to get home, and yet here they were trapped in the crosshairs of something they couldn't understand. The more the father thought about it, the more the weight of the situation pressed down on him. This wasn't just about a broken tail light anymore. This wasn't just about some mistake. This was personal. And the family was caught right in the middle of it. "I don't know what you're talking about," the father finally managed to say, his voice low but steady, though every word felt like a struggle. He had to keep his composure. He had to keep the situation from spiraling further. But inside, panic was threatening to consume him. What was this file? What had they been accused of? The plainclothes officer stepped closer, closing the gap between them. His eyes never left the father, and his presence was almost suffocating. "That's not for you to know," he said, his voice now colder, more final. "But it's clear to us now that we need to take you in. You've got questions, and I'm sure you'll get answers at the station." The father's blood ran cold. Take him in? They hadn't done anything wrong. They were just an ordinary family, trying to get through an ordinary night. But the reality of the situation was beginning to hit him. He had no choice. The officers were ready to escalate this. He was being pulled deeper into something far bigger than he could have imagined. The family's world seemed to shatter around them as the officers moved into position. The father's breath quickened as he tried to process everything that was happening, but it felt like a dream, a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. He could see the fear in his wife's eyes now, mirrored in the children's expressions. They were scared more than scared. They were terrified, and that fear was growing with every second. Before he could say another word, one of the officers moved to open the car door. The family's children watched in wide-eyed silence, their hands pressed against the windows, desperately trying to make sense of the confusion and fear swirling around them. The father's heart clenched. He couldn't protect them. Not this time. The officers had made up their minds, and whatever happened next, he was powerless to stop it. The plainclothes officer stepped back slightly, but his eyes never left the father. "You've been flagged, and that's something we're going to have to investigate. For now, you need to come with us." The words landed like a hammer blow. The father stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. Everything inside him screamed to fight back, but he knew that would only make things worse. He wasn't sure what they were after, or why they had singled his family out, but it didn't matter. The stakes were higher than he could have ever anticipated, and the fear that gripped his heart was only intensifying. In that moment, the father knew one thing for certain: this wasn't going to end quietly. This was just the beginning. The father's mind was racing as the plainclothes officer's words echoed in his ears. The situation was escalating so quickly, and everything he had feared was now coming to a head. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach as the officer motioned for the other officers to step forward. The family was out of options. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore, this was something much more serious. Whatever this file was, whatever they were being accused of, the father couldn't escape it now. They had come for him, for his family. He had to go with them. He glanced back at his wife, whose eyes were full of worry and unspoken fear. The children, still too young to understand the full extent of the situation, pressed their faces against the windows, helpless in their confusion. The father could see the panic creeping into their eyes, and it made his resolve falter for just a moment. But then, something inside him hardened. He couldn't let them go through this. He had to protect them, no matter what it took. He turned back to the officers. "I'm not going anywhere unless you explain what this is about. What's in this file? Why are you doing this?" His voice was steady, but the tension in his muscles was evident. He couldn't back down now. Not when the stakes were so high. The plainclothes officer didn't immediately respond. He just stood there, coldly assessing the father as if waiting for the final straw to break. The silence between them was thick, every passing second loaded with more pressure than the last. The father could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his hands shaking, but he refused to look away. He was done being intimidated. They had come this far. He needed to know what they wanted. Then, without warning, the officer stepped closer. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice firm, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, an uncertainty, a hesitation. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but the father caught it, and in that moment, something changed. The officer's words weren't as certain as they had been moments ago. "I don't know what you think you're doing," the father said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "But if you want to arrest me, you better have a good reason." The officer opened his mouth, about to respond, when suddenly, the sound of another car screeching to a halt echoed across the street. The headlights flooded the scene once again, but this time, it was different. The new car wasn't just any ordinary vehicle, it was an unmarked black SUV. The officer stiffened, and the plainclothes officer's gaze flickered toward the approaching vehicle. Something was happening. Something was about to change. The SUV's door swung open, and a figure stepped out. The father didn't recognize the man at first, but he could tell by the way the officers reacted that this was someone important. The new arrival's presence was commanding, almost overpowering. He wore a dark suit, his posture exuding authority. His eyes scanned the scene before locking onto the father with a piercing intensity. "Step aside," the man ordered, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The plainclothes officer immediately stepped back, the authority in the new arrival's voice unmistakable. The father's confusion deepened. Who was this person, and why had they shown up just now? What was going on? Without waiting for a response, the man in the suit approached the father directly, his eyes narrowing as he sized him up. There was no question now this was the person in charge. This wasn't just some random police officer or a lower-ranking agent. This was someone powerful. The father's gut instinct told him this wasn't just a case of mistaken identity or a bad traffic stop. Whatever was going on here, it was far bigger than he could have imagined. The man's next words sent a shock through the father. "You're not under arrest," he said flatly. "Not yet, anyway." The father's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" "I don't understand. This isn't just a random stop. What's going on?" His voice trembled, a mix of frustration and relief slowly washing over him. The weight of the situation felt too heavy, and he couldn't keep up with the twists anymore. The man in the suit stepped closer, his eyes cold, but there was something in his expression now, a kind of sadness, maybe even regret. "It's complicated," he said, looking away for a brief moment before returning his gaze to the father. "This whole thing has been a setup from the start." The father's heart skipped a beat. A setup? What was he talking about? Everything he believed about the situation was starting to unravel in front of him. "Who set this up?" the father demanded. He needed answers, something to make sense of the chaos that had surrounded him for so long. The man paused for a moment, as if weighing the decision to speak. He glanced at the other officers, who were now standing in the background, their expressions unreadable. Then he sighed. It wasn't just the police. Someone else is pulling the strings. Someone higher up. And your family have been targeted. The father's mind was spinning. Targeted? He couldn't comprehend it. Why? What had they done to deserve this? Why us? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's expression softened, but only slightly. You were chosen. Something in your past, something you don't even know about, has made you a target. You were flagged, not because of a broken tail light, but because of your connection to something much larger. We're just trying to protect you from something that's coming. Before the father could process what he had just heard, the man held up his hand. Don't speak yet. I know you have questions. But right now, there's no time. We need to move. Your family's safety is at risk. You need to trust me. The father stood frozen, every fiber of his being resisting the urge to lash out in anger. This was too much. The truth felt so far out of reach, so distorted by layers of lies. But he could see the genuine concern in the man's eyes. He had no choice. They had to leave, and they had to leave now. The man in the suit motioned for the officers to clear the way, and without another word, the father took a shaky step forward, his mind still reeling. The family's car was now surrounded by more officers, all of them silent, and all of them watching with a strange, almost mournful expression. As the father and his family walked to the SUV, the father looked back one last time at the scene. His mind was still processing the overwhelming flood of information, but one thing was clear: everything he had thought was true, everything he believed about this encounter, had been shattered. And just before the door to the SUV closed behind him, the man in the suit whispered, "This isn't over." Not by a long shot. With that final cryptic statement, the world outside seemed to blur, the noise of the city fading away as the vehicle sped off into the night. The father, his family silent beside him, didn't know where they were going, or who they could trust anymore. But he did know one thing: whatever had started tonight was far from finished, and the real danger was just beginning. The SUV's engine hummed steadily as it sped down unfamiliar roads. The father, his hands still shaking, gripped the seat tightly as he tried to make sense of everything that had just transpired. The family was quiet now, the children huddled together in the back seat, their faces pale with confusion and fear. The mother sat beside him, her eyes filled with questions that neither of them had the answers to. The only sound that filled the car was the rush of wind as they drove faster, farther from the scene that had unraveled their lives in mere moments. As the minutes passed, the man in the suit glanced back at them, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, there was something about them. They weren't cold or calculating anymore. They seemed tired. The weight of whatever had brought them all here seemed to press down on him just as much as it did on the father. "You still haven't told me what's going on," the father said, his voice low but firm. He needed answers. The uncertainty that had taken root in his mind was suffocating, and he couldn't bear it any longer. The man in the suit hadn't explained much, only that they were in danger, and that someone else was pulling the strings. But who? And why them? The man turned to him, his face serious. "I know you have questions, and I'll answer them. But first, you need to understand something." He paused, glancing out the window before returning his gaze to the father. "This goes deeper than you realize. Deeper than any of us realized. Your family, your history, it's all connected. And you've been pulled into something much bigger than a simple police stop." The father felt his heart race again. "What are you talking about? What history? We're just a regular family." The man sighed, his fingers tapping on the dashboard as though searching for the right words. "Your family's been under surveillance for years. You just didn't know it. All of you. It's not your fault. But you're linked to something dangerous. And the authorities, they've been trying to figure out how to deal with it for a long time." The father's mind spun as the man's words sank in. His past, his family's past, what was it? He was just an ordinary man. Nothing about their lives had seemed special, until now. But why us? What's the connection? The man's gaze softened, a brief flicker of empathy in his eyes. "It's your father," he said quietly, his tone almost reluctant. "Your father's work. Your family's history in this country. It all ties into something far bigger than anyone could have predicted." The father felt the blood drain from his face. His father? The man who had raised him, worked hard every day, never involved in anything illegal or shady, as far as he knew. The man who had always been there for him. "My father was just a regular guy." "What are you saying?" The father's voice cracked as his thoughts raced. The man hesitated for a long moment before answering. "Your father was part of a covert operation. A government program classified secret. He didn't know the full extent of it either, but he was involved in something that had lasting repercussions. And now, those repercussions are falling on your family. The things he did, the choices he made, they're catching up with you." The silence in the car grew heavy as the father tried to process this new information. His mind felt like it was spinning. His father, a part of something so dangerous? It didn't make sense. But why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he warn me? The man in the suit shook his head. "Your father wasn't allowed to. The operation was compartmentalized. He didn't have a choice in the matter. He thought he was doing the right thing at the time, but now, well, now it's your family that's paying the price." The father felt like the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. He thought of his father, of the quiet man who had been so protective, so steady. Had all those years of being a good man, a good father, been for nothing? Was it all part of a much larger, more dangerous game? The SUV slowed as they approached a secluded house nestled in the woods. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest cabin that looked like it had been there for years. The man in the suit signaled for them to get out. "We need to keep you here for a while, away from the prying eyes of anyone who might be watching. It's not safe for you to go back home, not yet." The father glanced at his wife. She looked just as overwhelmed as he felt. But there was no choice. They had to follow. They had to stay safe. They had to figure out how to survive whatever had been set in motion all those years ago. They stepped out of the SUV, and the man in the suit led them into the cabin. The inside was sparse, but it had all the necessities. A place to sleep, food, a few chairs. The father sank into a chair, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. He wanted answers. He needed them. But for now, all he could do was wait. For the next few days, the family remained in the cabin, under constant watch, though it was clear that the man in the suit was trying to protect them. He kept his distance but would occasionally drop by to check on them, bringing cryptic information and half-answers. The tension never lifted. The father would spend hours pacing, thinking of his children and wondering what would become of them. One afternoon, the man returned with a thick folder in his hand. He sat down across from the father, his face serious. "There's more you need to know. The organization your father was a part of is still active. And they're after you now, not just because of his involvement, but because of what's coming. There's a larger plan at play, something even bigger than your father could have understood. And it's about to unfold." The father swallowed hard, the fear building up in his chest again. "What do you mean? What are they planning?" The man set the folder down in front of him, slowly sliding it across the table. "I can't give you all the details. It's too dangerous. But I've been trying to protect your family, trying to keep you safe. They want to use you, your knowledge of your father's work. They're trying to control everything, and they've been watching you for years." The father felt his stomach twist. Everything he thought he knew was unraveling. His family, his life, everything had been built on a lie. And now, they were caught in the middle of it all. But there was something else in the folder. Something the man hadn't shared yet. The father opened it carefully, scanning the documents inside. His eyes stopped on a series of photos, pictures of his father, but also of him. Of his family. Some were recent, others were older. They had been under surveillance for years, long before the incident on the side of the road. This wasn't just about one police stop. It was about something far more sinister. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" The father whispered, his hands trembling as he stared at the pictures. "I wasn't sure you'd believe me," the man replied quietly. "But it's not too late. You're still in danger, and your family is too. But if you can help us, we can end this. We can stop whatever is coming." The father stared at the folder, the weight of it all pressing on him. His father's secrets, his own past, the life he had built with his family, everything had led to this moment. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he would fight for his family. No matter the cost. It wasn't long before the family was ready to leave the cabin. They had to disappear again, to stay hidden until they could figure out their next move. The man in the suit, who had become their only lifeline in this tangled web of deception, gave them one final piece of advice. Stay low. Trust no one. And whatever you do, don't let them find you. The family climbed into another vehicle, leaving the cabin behind. As they drove off into the night, the father's mind raced. The world they had known was gone. Their future was uncertain. But for the first time in what felt like forever, they were a family united, despite the dangers that loomed ahead. They didn't know what would happen next. But they knew that, whatever it was, they would face it together. And in the end, that was the one thing they could control. The story wasn't over. Far from it. But for now, they were safe. And that, in itself, was something worth holding on to.